Travis Langford was just another quiet man in Kodiak, Alaska until he vanished into the wilderness, fired on state troopers, and turned the frozen forest into a war zone. What drove him from silence to gunfire? And how did one man outwit an entire law enforcement force in one of the most remote places on Earth? Kodiak, Alaska, was a place where change came slowly and danger rarely knocked. Locals lived off the land, trusting the wilderness more than the world beyond. It was the kind of town where people left doors unlocked and neighbors waved from snowmobiles. But on the morning of January 6th, everything shifted. A mail carrier taking his usual route along the forest's edge spotted something that didn't belong. A gray pickup truck sat idling near a frozen trailhead, its windshield frosted from the inside. The driver's seat was empty, but what disturbed him was the loaded hunting rifle on the passenger side and the bloodied glove tucked carelessly on the dash. He reported it to the local authorities, who quickly traced the truck to Travis Langford, a 39-year-old man with a minor history of run-ins with wildlife enforcement and an otherwise quiet reputation. He lived alone in a cabin just outside town, kept to himself, and was rarely seen in daylight. When troopers arrived at the scene, they found footprints leading from the truck into the dense forest. Snow had partially covered the tracks, suggesting whoever left had been gone for hours, maybe longer. There were no signs of a struggle, but blood was splattered on the inner door and near the tire, suggesting an injury of some kind. Helicopters were launched, snowmobiles deployed, and dogs brought in to track the scent. But the trail disappeared into the vast frozen woods. What began as a welfare check soon turned into a search and rescue. Locals watched the unfolding operation with confusion. Travis wasn't the type to just vanish. He had no close family, no job to report to, and few friends to speak of. But he had survival skills enough to live alone through Kodiak winters with minimal contact. 2 days passed without a trace. Then the situation escalated. A cabin near the lake was broken into. Supplies were stolen, including canned food, ammunition, and a heavy winter coat. Footprints left behind matched the ones near Travis's truck. But now, there was a new concern. He was alive, he was armed, and he was taking what he needed to stay hidden. The discovery marked a shift in tone. No longer a missing person, Travis Langford was now a fugitive in the wild, blending into a frozen world he knew far too well. The silence of Kodiak had been broken. Something dangerous was brewing in the woods. 2 days after the break-in at the lake cabin, Alaska state troopers intensified their efforts. The new evidence confirmed that Travis Langford was still alive and deliberately evading capture. His trail showed calculated movement. He knew which cabins were unoccupied, where to find supplies, and how to move without leaving an obvious path. For the people of Kodiak, fear began to replace curiosity. The wilderness that once brought comfort now felt like a hiding place for something unpredictable. Authorities suspected Travis was becoming more desperate. The fact that he took ammunition was especially concerning. Until that point, he had avoided confrontation, but now he was preparing for it. That evening, Trooper Evan Collister and his partner were patrolling a snow-covered route that bordered a series of backwoods hunting trails. Visibility was low, and the cold was biting through layers of thermal gear. Around midnight, just as they were about to turn back, Collister spotted a snowmobile's faint tracks veering off the trail into a densely wooded area. He followed them cautiously, the sound of his engine muffled by the falling snow. Up ahead, barely visible in the dark, a figure emerged from the trees and stopped. The rider turned their head toward the patrol vehicle. Then came the sound, sharp, violent, unmistakable. A rifle cracked through the silence, and the windshield exploded into shards. Collister ducked just in time. Another round slammed into the front grille, sending sparks into the snow. The gunman vanished back into the trees before the troopers could react. Backup was called, and searchlights swept the forest, but Travis was gone. The incident changed everything. Now it was more than a search, it was a pursuit of a suspect who had fired at law enforcement. Troopers issued a public alert. Schools closed early, roads were monitored, and helicopters flew overhead, scanning the vast white wilderness. Despite the size of the task force, they were hunting a man who had grown up in these woods and who had no intention of being caught. Media reports picked up the story, painting Travis as a rogue survivalist, unstable and heavily armed. But in Kodiak, the mood was more uncertain. People remembered him as quiet, even shy. No one understood what could drive a man to vanish into the snow and start shooting. But whatever the reason, One thing was now certain: Travis had declared war on the ones trying to bring him in. By the third day of the manhunt, the landscape had transformed into a high-alert zone. The Alaska State Troopers had expanded their search perimeter to nearly 200 square miles, deploying snowmobiles, drones, helicopters, and thermal imaging equipment. Yet despite all the manpower and technology, Travis Langford remained a ghost in the trees. He left behind just enough clues to show he was still moving: footprints appearing near frozen creeks, half-eaten food scraps in abandoned sheds, even melted snow where a fire had been extinguished hours earlier. Every sign pointed to a man who was not only surviving in the sub-zero temperatures, but staying a step ahead of those trying to capture him. A critical clue came when a game warden, checking animal traps in a restricted zone, stumbled across a hidden shelter built into a hillside. It was constructed from old lumber and packed tightly with snow for insulation. Inside were empty cans, a worn sleeping bag, and maps of the area marked with hand-drawn routes. One of those routes led to a series of trapper-esque cabins near the Aleutic Reserve, places known only to locals who had spent years navigating the unforgiving terrain. It was clear Travis had mapped out an escape strategy long before he disappeared. The discovery raised new concerns. This was no aimless fugitive reacting to panic. This was someone who had prepared for the long haul. Law enforcement began to suspect that the shooting incident hadn't been an act of desperation, but a calculated decision to keep them at bay. The theory was that Travis saw the woods not as a hiding place, but as his territory, and any pursuit as a violation. The psychological profile shifted, from a troubled loner to a strategic threat. Later that night, a wildlife camera set up near a narrow trail captured a blurred image of a man dragging a sled loaded with supplies. His face was mostly covered, but investigators recognized the camouflage coat stolen during the earlier cabin raid. The direction of travel matched one of the marked routes on the recovered maps. Troopers set up checkpoints along the nearby passes, hoping to finally cut him off, but by morning, there was no sign of him. Snowfall during the night had covered any trace. Each failed attempt to capture him deepened the sense of unease. Travis wasn't just hiding, he was moving with purpose, drawing out the chase, and turning the wilderness into a battleground he knew better than anyone. The fourth day began with a jolt of urgency. Just before sunrise, a hardware store owner in Port Lions reported a break-in. The security footage, although grainy from the frost-covered lens, showed a masked figure moving swiftly through the aisles. He avoided the cameras directly, taking only what he needed: propane canisters, trail snacks, a battery-powered radio, and a flare gun. The way he moved, calculated and precise, left little doubt. It was Travis Langford. Investigators confirmed it when they found a torn patch of camouflage cloth near the broken window, matching the coat he had stolen earlier in the week. With the flare gun now in his possession, authorities feared he could be planning a signal or a trap. Every item he took seemed to serve a purpose, fueling the theory that he had a long-term survival plan in place. The cold was intensifying, but that didn't slow him. Instead, it seemed the weather was working in his favor, masking his movements and hindering the search teams who weren't as comfortable in the elements. Late that evening, a drone equipped with thermal imaging picked up faint heat signatures near an icy creek bed just outside a frozen ravine. A response team moved in silently, surrounding the area with night vision and thermal scopes. From a distance, they saw a flicker flame from a small fire, barely visible against the white. As they inched closer, they realized the fire was coming from a pile of brush surrounding a large metal container. Before they could move in, a sudden flash lit the sky. A flare had been launched bright red, screaming upward like a warning. Seconds later, the container erupted in flames. One of the propane canisters had been rigged near the brush pile, turning the quiet ravine into a burning trap. The explosion threw chunks of ice into the air and blinded the troopers. Amid the confusion, gunshots rang out again, and officers took cover. In the chaos, Travis managed to vanish once more, leaving behind scorched earth and smoldering debris. But this time, he left something else, a trail of blood leading into the trees. He had likely injured himself in the explosion or the escape, giving investigators their first real sign of vulnerability. The chase had become something darker. It was no longer just survival, it was sabotage, defiance, and a final push from a man who seemed to have nothing left to lose. By the fifth day, the manhunt had consumed the entire region. Troopers were operating on rotating shifts, helicopters scanned day and night, and the forest felt like it was being peeled apart, inch by inch. News outlets broadcast hourly updates. and the once quiet town of Kodiak now resembled a military staging ground. Travis Langford had become more than a fugitive. He was now a symbol of fear, obsession, and mystery. But time was no longer on his side. The explosion from the night before had not only exposed his location but also left a trace of blood across the snow, suggesting he was injured and slowing down. Investigators tracked the blood trail deep into the interior, where thick evergreens swallowed light and the snow hung in frozen drifts. After several hours of following a zigzagging path, they came across another one of Travis's makeshift shelters, this one hastily assembled, with bloodstains on a strip of cloth used as a bandage. Nearby, torn pages from an old survival manual were scattered in the snow, many soaked and frozen. It was the first time authorities had gotten close enough to touch the world Travis had been surviving in, and it felt desperate. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He was deteriorating. The end came not with gunfire or flames, but with a silent call. A bush pilot delivering supplies to a remote fishing camp spotted smoke spiraling from a ridge that wasn't marked on any hunting maps. The area was miles from the last known sighting, isolated by steep terrain and frozen rivers. A ground team was dispatched and began the slow ascent. By dusk, they found a small cave carved into the cliffside. Smoke trickled from a tiny vent near the top, barely visible against the rock. Inside, they found Travis curled in a corner, half-conscious and severely frostbitten. His rifle lay across his lap unloaded, and beside him was a radio playing static. A single photograph sat atop a piece of canvas near the fire's ashes. It showed a young girl with long dark hair, smiling. Records later revealed she was his daughter, who had died 3 years earlier in a highway accident in Anchorage. Travis didn't resist. He didn't speak. He was flown out by helicopter under heavy guard. The hunt was over, but the questions remained. No one knew whether he had planned to die alone or had simply lost his way in grief. What was certain, though, was that Alaska's vast silence had witnessed one of its darkest, most haunting chapters.